Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 288. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm talking about the impact of U.S. sanctions on Russia fossil fuel revenue. So, share today's show, a lot of important stuff. You can find the show at the Libertarian Institute and also on the Libertarian Institute All podcast feed. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the video version at Rumble, YouTube, and Odysee. You can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnslone _, and you can support the show on Patreon or Subscribestar, and we also take crypto, all that information in the show notes page. You can also help out the show by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. That'll save you 20% when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. So it's a great way to support your favorite podcast and get yourself some high quality CBD products. My favorite products at Paloma Verde are the topicals, particularly the sports cream. It's got a nice, refreshing menthol smell. It goes on, doesn't require very much of the product to get the full CBD pain relief effect from the sports cream, and then it lasts for a very long time. So PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. All right, let's get into the show. The first article I have to talk about today, I wrote for antiwar.com on June 12th, titled Turkey's concerns about Finland and Sweden joining NATO are legitimate, and that is a statement from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And then I write, objections from Turkey have stalled membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for Finland and Sweden. On Sunday, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Ankara's concerns about terrorism were legitimate. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Finland and Sweden support members of the Kurdish Workers' Party, or PKK. Ankara claims the PKK is a terrorist group and has fought a multi-decade-long insurgency against the country's Kurdish minority. During a meeting with Finland's president, Stoltenberg weighed in on Turkey's concerns. These are legitimate concerns. This is about terrorism and about weapon exports, and we have to understand and remember that no other NATO ally has suffered more terrorist acts than Turkey. Now, of course, he leaves out in this statement how Turkey has, discriminated against and fought this insurgency against the, Kurdish population, which has resulted in at least part of the terrorist activity in Turkey. And then Turkey also facilitated a lot of jihadists moving into Syria because Turkey was looking to exploit the Syrian civil war to take its long time problematic neighbor Bashar al-Assad down, and so facilitated ISIS fighters, Al-Qaeda fighters fundraising and moving through Turkey, which has of course led to some of the terrorist activity in Turkey as well. So Secretary General Stoltenberg laid out why Ankara was an essential member of the alliance. He pointed out Turkey's strategic location on the Black Sea. He added, we also need to take into account that no other NATO ally hosts more refugees than Turkey. And this is something that is very, very important, actually. So for probably 8 or 9 years now, there's been millions of refugees from the Syrian civil war in Turkey for that long, nearly a decade at this point. Turkey has been using those refugees as leverage, essentially saying that they're going to either facilitate or allow those Syrian refugees to move across Turkey and then into Europe, and now even maybe intentionally exporting them could be a part of Ankara's policy there. But since there's millions of people and you have the EU and NATO and these Western countries have grandstanded for so long on how you have to take care of refugees, etc., etc., etc. If those refugees do make it into these countries, they're concerned that it'll be like a fiscal and maybe even like a cultural burden, and so they don't want those refugees in their countries. And Turkey, on several cases, has used this leverage to, get millions of dollars of funding and then get these Western countries to lay off some. On either their support for the Syrian Kurds or at least allow Turkey to attack the Syrian Kurds that are supported by the rest of NATO minus Turkey. And then I just wrap up the article here. Helsinki and Stockholm submitted NATO applications last month. Stoltenberg and Secretary of State Antony Blinken have repeatedly expressed that Finland and Sweden would become alliance members in short order. However, to join NATO, a country must receive support from all other member states, and Ankara has placed a roadblock in the membership process. Recent developments in Stockholm have made it less likely that Ankara's concerns will be resolved. To survive a no confidence vote, Sweden's ruling Democratic Social Democrats needed the support of independent member of parliament of Kurdish Iranian heritage. Her vote gave the Social Democrats the majority, like the actual one vote they needed. And then after the vote, the Swedish member of parliament gave her assurances that they won't cave to Turkey's demands regarding Kurdish militant groups. And so this suggests that there's not going to be a change in policy in Sweden here. And then we also had Helsinki come out yesterday and say that they would not join NATO without Sweden. And so with these two countries now saying that they're going to come as a package deal, and Sweden saying that they're not budging on a core issue that even the NATO Secretary General is saying a legitimate concern of Turkey, may actually be enough to prevent NATO membership for Sweden and Finland. I didn't, once I thought the membership process had started, I thought that they would either find a workaround for Turkey's concerns, just ignore them, or pay Turkey enough of a bribe to appease Turkey, because the country is going through some economic hardships right now, and I'm sure a massive infusion of cash wouldn't necessarily at least be unhelpful in the short term for the Turkish government. So there's that. Now, I want to talk about a few other things on this subject before I move on and talk about the sanctions here. The first being that the Western countries are carrying out the Baltops war games in the Baltic Sea. These are hosted by Sweden, so particularly provocative at this point, but they're actually holding these war games in part on an island in the Baltic Sea that had been previously demilitarized. And then Turkey is carrying out quite a number of operations in Iraq, and that is continuing. One of the few people who's bothering to try to report on this and track this is Margaret Griffith at antiwar.com, and this from June 2nd. She says fighting between Turkey and the PKK in Zab left 4 Turkish soldiers dead. 3 guerrillas were killed in a separate incident. And so, at least this is some monitoring of the situation in Iraq and Turkey's military operations there. You had this amazing scenario right now where in Iraq and Syria, you have Turkey carrying out an invasion of both countries against the will of Damascus and Baghdad. And then, in Syria, additionally, you have the U.S. occupying quarter to a third of the country, and then the Israeli government regularly carrying out airstrikes against the Syrian government. And so, you blame Russia about violations of sovereignty of its neighbor Ukraine, and rightfully so, but nobody is pointing out what's happening here. And it's not like the war in Syria or the, multiple wars we've had in Iraq were particularly were very deadly. And so, to say that, we had to pay attention to Ukraine uniquely because it's somehow worse just really isn't true. And, for Syria right now, the Israeli strikes are particularly devastating and targeting civilian infrastructure. And the recent attacks on the Damascus airport will apparently keep it shuttered for months at this point. And I mean, Israel is carrying out 2-3 attacks a week right now in Syria. So one more update on Iraq that I thought was important to just note. The bloc headed by Iraqi influential cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, the Sadrist. There were 73 members of parliament of that bloc, and they have all resigned. And apparently, that move will force a new election in Iraq. Now, one of the reasons that this is so important is elections in Iraq tend to create some violence and a good amount of instability. And so, having another round of elections likely isn't going to lead to any political clarity in the country. A few more notes on NATO, Finland, Sweden stuff before we move on to the sanctions. The West is refusing to give Russia any assurances that they won't put nuclear weapons in the Nordic states, and so that's a Russian red line. And it would be a way to maybe not add tensions to the U.S. NATO Russian relationship because Russia has said, look, if Sweden and Finland join NATO, that's not a concern. The concern is the military buildup, the deployment of nukes in the region, and the West is already saying that they're not going to give assurances on that, even though I think Finland said that they don't even want to host nukes. There is... the let's see, second in command on the civilian side of NATO said that they will be putting a new base in Eastern Europe. So, Dave DeCamp wrote this one for antiwar.com on June 10th. He says, on Friday, NATO Deputy Secretary General said that he expects the Western military alliance to establish permanent bases in Eastern Europe in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Under the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, the alliance agreed not to build permanent bases east of Germany, but the Deputy Secretary General suggested that the deal is now void because of the Russia invasion. He said that part of NATO's plans, the alliance is working on a state-of-the-art permanent presence in Eastern Europe at an upcoming NATO summit in Madrid scheduled for later this month. He said the alliance will be working on a fundamental transformation of NATO's posture and presence and deterrence in the region, which will include more of a presence on the ground. So now let's move on and talk about sanctions. And the first article I have is from June 12th at antiwar.com by myself and Will Porter. I think this is the most important thing I have to talk about today. U.S. official admits Russia energy sales outpacing pre-war levels. The U.S. Energy Secretary Envoy Amos Hochstein has acknowledged that Russia might be making more revenue from fossil fuels now than before its February invasion of Ukraine. Washington has responded with waves of sanctions aiming to crush the Russian economy. The envoy made the comments during a hearing for the Senate Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation in response to a question about whether Moscow was making more money off its fossil fuel sales. He said, "I can't deny that." In May, the International Energy Agency said Russia's oil revenue was up 50% this year. Hochstein said the White House did not anticipate the spike in oil prices, noting that the demand for oil in 2022 is far greater, stronger than anyone predicted. Now, this is always what politicians and White House officials will say when things don't go the way they expect. Well, nobody could have predicted it, even though I think was fairly predictable that there would be a pretty good increase in demand for oil as the worldwide lockdowns were being rolled back over, the course of the past 6 months or so. International travel opening up, people are getting rid of vaccine mandates and things like this, testing requirements. The U.S. just dropped its requirement if you're traveling internationally to have a negative test within a day of the travel as requested by the U.S. airlines. So, amazing what you could do when you're a multi-billion-dollar company and you request something from the the government, and suddenly they do it, even though, they didn't produce a study or any kind of, scientific reason to actually withdraw that mandate. But the airlines requested it, and then it happened. But moving back to what I should be talking about here, over the past 3 months, the U.S. and its Western partners have heavily sanctioned the Russian energy imports and attempted to pressure the rest of the world to do the same. Beyond Europe, however, the effort has largely been unsuccessful, as countries like India have boosted Russian oil purchases. The envoy went on to say that the Biden administration believes there will be a ceiling on the amount of Russian oil India will import. He did not clarify the White House's reasoning for that assessment or what that ceiling might be. While the United States and its NATO allies claim to be crippling the Russian economy, the sanctions campaign does not appear to be having the intended effect, with the ruble being recently becoming the best performing currency against the dollar this year. In the U.S., price inflation is rampant, with most Americans now paying over $5 per gallon for gas, and some nearly double that. So I think it's pretty easy to see with the contrast there, how the sanctions have impacted the Western economies versus the Russian economy. It hasn't gone so well, and we talked about this in the lead up to the invasion, and then when the invasion itself started, saying that the sanctions really weren't a threat against Russia, that Russia had sanction-proof its economy. And while there was a blow to the Russian economy initially when the sanctions hit, when the Nord Stream 2 pipeline didn't turn on, etc., but now it seems that the Russian economy has largely recovered. But that doesn't stop the U.S. from adding sanctions. Myself and Will Porter wrote this on June 7th for the Libertarian Institute. New sanctions bar Americans from buying Russian debt and stocks. The Treasury Department has issued a new decree prohibiting money managers from trading Russian debt or stocks in U.S. secondary markets. The latest round of sanctions comes as Washington attempts to further isolate Moscow in retaliation for its attack on Ukraine. While a prior round of penalties barred Americans from directly buying Russian assets, the White House allowed trading to continue in secondary markets. With the Treasury's latest dictate on Monday, that exemption is now closed, though citizens will still be able to hold any previously owned Russian stocks or debt. And this from the Treasury Department spokesperson. Consistent with our goal to deny Russia the financial resources it needs to continue its brutal war against Ukraine, the Treasury has made it clear that U.S. persons are prohibited from making new investments in the success of Russia, including through purchases on the secondary market. The stepped-up sanctions come amid a flurry of other Western penalties, which Joe Biden has said are intended to cripple the Russian economy and harm its war effort. During a visit to Lithuania on Tuesday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz reiterated that stance, voicing his hopes the sanctions would inflict long-term damage. This from Scholz. We have far-reaching sanctions now that will set back the Russian economy by decades. That means it will not be able to participate in global economic and technological process. We know from reports that this means Russia will not even be able to retain its military capacities at the same level. The sanctions campaign has taken some toll on Moscow, though it may not be having the intended effect, as embargoes on Russian energy and other exports are creating conditions for major international shortages felt through the rest. The ruble, meanwhile, is now the best performing currency against the dollar in 2022, propped up by capital controls after briefly tumbling. And then China and India particularly have picked up a lot of those, portions of the market that the West, was importing from Russia and then stopped. So I think that's why I have on sanctions. But, this is just a big reminder that they have these sanctions in place. It's supposed to be harming the Russian economy. It's not. The American and the Western economies are being harmed, though. And so very interesting how this all ends up working out. Next up, article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on June 9th. Russia says Western cyber attacks increase risk of direct military clash. On Thursday, Russia blamed the U.S. and Ukraine for cyber attacks on its state institutions and critical infrastructure and warned the West that cyber attacks increase the risk of direct military clash. And this from the Russian Foreign Ministry. The militarization of the information space by the West and attempts to turn it into an area of interstate confrontation have greatly increased the threat of military clash with unpredictable consequences. The Russian warning came after the U.S. said it was conducting offensive cyber operations in Ukraine. The head of the U.S. Cyber Command said last week that the U.S. had conducted a series of operations across the full spectrum offensive, defensive, and information operations. And at the time, when we read that story, talked about on the show, we warned that, hey, Russia may respond to this kind of thing. The U.S. has said that if Russia conducted offensive cyber operations against the West, it would be considered a violation or it would invoke NATO's Article 5 commitment, which, you know, mutual defense, an attack against one is an attack against all. So they're saying a Russian cyber attack would be considered an attack. And so, you know, there's no reason to think that Russia wouldn't interpret this the same way. All right, two quick stories to talk about here before I move on and talk about a few other things, but these are more tangentially related to the Russia issue. The Sperry is an international arms watchdog. They track how much different countries are spending on their military. You know, the stats every year that come out. The U.S. is spending as much as the next 8, 9, 10 countries on military combined often come from this group. It says that we should expect more nukes to be built in the coming years for the first time since the Cold War. So that's, you know, really disappointing. And then the White House supports Congress upping the defense budget, which we anticipate here. But at the same time, having that official from the government is always interesting because, you know, the government budget is out of control. All right, time to move on and talk about the Middle East. This article from June 12th at antiwar.com. Biden says Saudi visit about Israel, not gas prices. President Joe Biden answered questions about his potential visit to Saudi Arabia. Biden said that meeting with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, would be about Israeli security, not energy. While Axios reported the trip would come mid-July, Biden did not commit to making the trip. Speaking with reporters outside of Air Force One on Sunday, Biden says, it happened to be a larger meeting taking place in Saudi Arabia. That's the reason I'm going. And it has to do with national security for them, for Israelis, he continued. I have a program anyway. It has much larger issues than having to do with energy price. The president did not commit to making the trip. Biden said no, not yet, to a question about finalizing the planned visit. However, Axios reported speaking with 3 Israeli officials who said Biden would be in Israel on July 14th and 15th before traveling to Saudi Arabia. So there's a little bit I want to unpack there. The first is Saudi Arabia is apparently holding a conference, is expected to include the GCC member states, and then I believe Jordan and Egypt as well. So, you know, a collection of the U.S. generally partner states in the Middle East, even if they don't always all get along, they pretty much always all get along with the U.S. and are willing to take money from the U.S. And so these are, generally speaking, the countries that we will be talking about in the next article from that me and Will wrote earlier in the week about a new bill being introduced as well. So that's happening. Linked to increased security ties in the Middle East between Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt, Kuwait, Oman. I'm guessing there's not going to be representatives from the Houthis there. So maybe the Saudi proxy government in Yemen. And Biden is saying that's the reason for his trip and not not about energy prices. Now, this almost seemed counterintuitive when I read it because if you talk to Americans right now, of course, top concern in polling is the economy, and then rising prices is, the top economic concern. And of course, if you're just talking about rising prices, one of the first things that comes up for most people, food or gas, right? That, like, those are the one and two things that people are buying every week. They constantly notice when the price of these products are going up. And so if Biden were saying, I'm going to Saudi Arabia to lower the price of oil so we get cheaper gas here in the United States, that may be a popular policy. However, Biden has met heavy criticism for his planned meeting with MBS. As a candidate, Biden pledged to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state and hold MBS accountable for the murder and dismemberment of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Since taking office, Biden has continued to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia and aid the country's war in Yemen. When the White House first floated the idea of a meeting between Biden and MBS in March, oil production was at the top of the agenda. The proposed visit was met with objections from progressive Democrats and Republicans. Biden may now be attempting to downplay discussions with MBS about energy policy to reduce criticism because, if you are talking about Congress, Israeli security is always popular. And we actually see we have a new piece of bipartisan legislation on that. This from myself and Will Porter on June 10th, writing at the Libertarian Institute. New bill to boost missile defense for Israel and Arab partners, citing alleged Iranian threat. Lawmakers with the bipartisan Abraham Accords caucus have introduced a bill in the House and Senate that will require the Pentagon to coordinate missile defense upgrades for Israel and several newfound Arab allies, pointing to potential attacks from Iran. Unveiled on Thursday, the Defend Enemy Forces and Enabling National Defenses, or DEFEND Act, would instruct the Secretary of Defense to develop an acquisitions approach to improve the anti-air weapons for a number of Middle Eastern states, among them Israel, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, and the six-member Gulf Cooperation Council. And that's Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and then Yemen with, I guess an asterisk for Yemen because of its current war-torn state. The legislation will aim to implement an integrated and missile defense capabilities to protect people, infrastructure, and territory of such countries from cruise and ballistic missiles, manned and unmanned aerial systems, and rocket attacks from Iran and groups linked to Iran. That is what the legislation says. If passed, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin will be required to submit a report to Congress within 180 days on the current defense capabilities in the questioned states and how they could be approved. Announced by Republican Senator Joni Ernst, she's from Iowa, the bill will marks the first piece of legislation to be brought by the Abraham Accord Caucus, a bipartisan bloc within the House and Senate created to build on the successes of a series of agreements struck between Israel and Arab nations in 2020. Now, these are billed by the Abraham Accords Caucus and most of Washington, D.C. as peace deals that were promoted by Donald Trump to normalize relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. However, what these really were weapon sales agreements, and the U.S. agreed to sell F-35s and Predator or Reaper drones to the UAE, and this provoked Israel actually, and they say, well, now you need to sell us more upgraded weaponry because we have to have more advanced weapons than all the Arab states. So, the Senator Joni Ernst claimed the law will help to contain Iranian proxy groups, which she said were targeting innocent civilians and pose a persistent threat to our homeland. I mean, this is just made up nonsense, fear-mongering that you're going to get from the war party. Though Ernst acknowledges most Americans are fed up with armed intervention in the Middle East, she argued that radical Islamic terror continues to menace the United States, saying terrorism can only be deterred and detained if American and its partners in the Middle East step up and take on the threat posed by Iran. Now, the most comical thing about this is if you were looking at what is generally defined as radical Islamic terrorism. This is Al Qaeda, this is ISIS. These are the Sunni jihadist groups that, if they have state benefactors, they are the states that we are talking about here. Even if you're looking at the Syrian civil war, it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Turkey, who's a NATO ally state, and then Israel, all supporting the groups opposing Bashar al-Assad that are infested with jihadist groups. If you look at Yemen, Ansar al-Sharia, the Houthis, are a Shia Zaidi group, and they are the long-time standing enemies of the jihadist factions, AQAP and ISIS, in Yemen, and yet the U.S., Saudi Arabia, the UAE are all backing these groups. And you could even find reporting from CNN documenting how Western weapons, including armored vehicles, are falling into the hands of these terrorist groups in Yemen because of what Saudi Arabia and the UAE are doing. So, what Ernst is saying there is just absolutely ridiculous. According to the Democrat Senator Jackie Rosen, the bill has the endorsement of several pro-Israel groups and hawkish think tanks, including the Anti-Defamation League, AIPAC, the American Jewish Committee, CUFI Action, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, FDD, the American Jewish Congress, the Atlantic Council, and the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, JINSA. In the backing the legislation, the neoconservative FDD said Washington should continue to initiate, develop, and enhance military relationships between the U.S., Israel, and other U.S. ally partners in the region as an extension of the Abraham Accords. Now, this is almost too rich, right? You had the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, right? And then partnering with the Joe Biden administration. Well, I guess this is with a bipartisan grouping in Congress, but you have then, the Biden administration, whose main foreign policy is essentially to divide the world into autocracies versus democracies. And here you have a group of countries where the only countries that could even label themselves a democracy and not a monarchy, ruled by a king, and these countries are ruled by a king and brutally suppress their minority populations, are Iraq and Israel doesn't let half of the people it controls vote because they're Palestinians, and is, by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Harvard Law, and the UN Secretary General's office all say it's an apartheid state. And then you have Iraq, which maybe has elections, but the political system is an absolute mess, and the U.S. is constantly warning about how the country is too closely tied to Iran. And so how any of these countries could be considered defending democracy in any way by giving them more weapons is absurd and hypocritical on its face. But, this is pretty standard U.S. foreign policy, I guess, at this point. So we just wrap up the article here. Kicked off with a U.S. brokered normalization deal between Israel and the UAE in 2020. The accords have since been joined by Bahrain, Egypt, Morocco, and Sudan, each agreeing to establish diplomatic economic ties with Tel Aviv after decades of, in some cases, tensions with Israel. Though the bill is largely concerned with Iran, some countries slated to receive and increase U.S. military assistance have been accused of backing jihadist military groups in the past, chief among them Saudi Arabia, and few of the 10 countries named could be qualified as democracies, and I've already given a little bit more analysis on that. So, let's see. There are a couple things I guess I want to mention here overall. The first is just what a train wreck the Biden foreign policy has been. Rather than it doesn't have to normalize relations with Venezuela or Iran, but getting back in the nuclear deal with Iran, allowing Iran to export its oil, and then also removing the Trump era sanctions on Venezuela could have really relieved a lot of these tensions, and then you're not getting deeper into bed with Saudi Arabia and these other terrible monarchies, and you're also not, directly supporting the Iranian or the Venezuelan governments. You're merely just being less aggressive and, having less policies that harm the civilian population of those countries, but rather now he's put himself where his back is against the wall on energy prices. And I do think, despite what the president is saying, the trip to Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, will be largely about energy prices. Now, a few more stories on Israel that I just wanted to mention pretty quickly here. On May 12th, we had the announcement of 4,000 new settlements, and of course, this came after the Israeli Supreme Court ruling on how settlements could be constructed, and so I'm expecting a lot more of those. I want to give a shout out to Representative Rashida Tlaib, who introduced the Nakba resolution, which, it's just a resolution, but it is something that I think could provoke a little bit more debate on the issue, more discussion around the Nakba and the apartheid state in Israel. Then June 9th, we have Israel rejecting a U.S. proposed summit with the Palestinians. And then in something that could be an indication of some changes in U.S. foreign policy towards Israel, though unlikely, the U.S. changed the name of its Palestinian diplomatic mission. Again, this could be symbolizing a larger change in the U.S. policy, or it could just be a meaningless, change the name of a building to try to make it look like you're doing a little bit of something when you're actually doing nothing. My guess is it's the latter, but it is what it is. All right, last up here. Biden reaffirms support for regime change in Venezuela, but says U.S. could calibrate sanctions. I think this is pretty interesting. Now, remember, this is going on as the Summit of the Americas is happening in the United States, I believe in Los Angeles. And during that, the Summit of the Americas and the lead up of it, it was a real political nightmare for the U.S. and Latin American policy, because we decided to exclude the president of 3 countries that we don't like. And in response, the president of Mexico led a block of other countries who didn't send their top level official and accept the U.S. invite, because the U.S. wasn't inviting all, American states. And so this has created a little bit of issue around the Venezuela issue, where the U.S. recognizes Juan Guaido as the leader of Venezuela, though he holds no actual power. And Nicolas Maduro continues to be the actual president of Venezuela. So we write here, President Joe Biden held a call with Juan Guaido to discuss possible sanctions relief for Venezuela. The White House recognizes Guaido as the country's interim president, though he holds no power in Caracas. Biden phoned the opposition leader from Air Force One while en route to Summit of the Americas conference in Los Angeles on Wednesday, with the White House summary of the call stating that the president underscored the United States recognition and support of the 2015 democratically elected National Assembly and Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. Guaido first proclaimed himself as president of Venezuela in 2019 following a disputed election, after which several Western nations recognized his claim to power. However, Guaido has been unable to unseat Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro despite several coup attempts over the past 3 years, which have received varying levels of U.S. backing. His support among Western governments has dwindled more recently, with the European Union ceasing to recognize his claim to the presidency last year, leaving Washington as one of his last remaining benefactors. During the Trump administration, the U.S. levied harsh sanctions on Venezuela, dubbed a maximum pressure policy. While the penalties had a devastating impact on average people alongside ruinous social policies imposed by the Maduro regime, the leader has kept a firm grip on power. With minor exceptions, the Biden has largely followed his predecessor's sanctions policy, with one U.S. official declaring last month that the administration's approach overall has not changed. However, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, the White House has shifted its stance towards Caracas, now seeing warmed relations with Maduro as a way to isolate Moscow. Talks between Biden and Maduro regimes began in March and have made slow progress. 2 Americans have been released from Venezuelan prisons, and the Biden administration has given some sanctions relief, including allowing 2 European companies to ship Venezuelan oil. Additionally, Biden spoke with Guaido about future sanctions relief for Venezuela during Wednesday's call, saying the United States is willing to calibrate sanctions policy depending on the outcomes of negotiations that empower the Venezuelan people to determine the future of their country. Several unnamed officials have hinted at the latter proposal in May, suggesting Washington could be willing to scale back penalties should the government in Caracas agree to meet with opposition leaders. The latest call with Guaido came as the United States opened the Summit of the Americas conference in Los Angeles, attended by officials from across the Western Hemisphere. The events were marred by some controversy for the White House, as Biden denied invites to Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega, and Maduro. Guaido also received no invitation and did not appear at the summit. The selective invites provoked other Central and South American leaders to boycott and protest, led by Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. The exclusion of the 3 leaders was also seen as hypocritical, for the president planning to visit the repressive Kingdom of Saudi Arabia later this month, although now I believe that it is going to take place in July. All right. So I think that about does it for the show today. I did see that apparently Guaido is being harassed by Venezuelans and has had at a couple restaurants, has been forced to leave, and people pushed him, and nobody you couldn't describe it as threatening his life, but it could be described as violence against Guaido in Venezuela, and the U.S. came out and condemned this. Now, obviously, I'm a libertarian. I believe in the non-aggression principle. I don't think anybody should be, pushing Juan Guaido around on the streets of Venezuela. However, I do think it's reflective of how unpopular the guy is because of his ties with the U.S., with Washington. And so my guess is that Washington condemning this isn't going to reduce the occurrence of it at all. And if the U.S. was really concerned about Guaido's safety, they should probably just stop backing his fictitious claim to power, because he has supported sanctions on the Venezuelan people, which have been very harmful for Venezuela. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrap up the show for today. Hope you're enjoying it. Please share the shows at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, anywhere you can listen to podcasts on the Libertarian Institute, all podcast feed. And you can follow me on Twitter at Anzalone _. Thanks, everyone.